Hi there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Cloud-Based Mayhem. Got a great show for you today. 5 times X-Alps competitor, Honza Rejmanek, great friend of mine, used to live here in Sun Valley. His exploits around Sun Valley are still legend. The guy just, he'll take off at times of the day where we would never even consider taking off, and he'll top land at the times of the day. He's just a paragliding Jedi. But a lot of people probably do know this. He writes a column in Cross Country. He has been doing it for years about meteorology. Honza got into flying a long time ago and then got super interested in meteorology and went to school in Davis and is now, that is his job as a meteorologist. So like Nick Nanens, who we had on the show a few months back, that's what he does. He studies the weather, and he's obviously got a whole lot of knowledge. Personally, I just find some of the articles that he does, they're great, but they're a little over my head. They can be pretty specific. So what we try to do here is just kind of talk about more general weather, things like blue holes and cloud streets and gust fronts and density of air and things that really apply to what we see, what we need to know, and how we can use it to fly farther, but also be a lot safer. So I think you're going to enjoy this. We also, of course, touched on some X-Alps stuff. He was third in 2009. Like I said, did 5 campaigns, which is pretty awesome. And so we definitely talked a little bit about the X-Alps, but being sensitive to, I know I've had quite a few of the X-Alps athletes on the show, so I promise I won't always do that. We just had Max on the show, which was great, but yeah, kind of a junkie, and I think people find that fun, so I hope you enjoy it. Before we get into the talk, just a few things of housekeeping. We're doing this giveaway for these really cool knee mounts. I was just going to do one, but we had a couple reviews went up, so I've got to give a couple of these away. Thanks to Ben French for sending me these. They're really cool. They're quite great mounts. I'll put them up on the website and a link to where you can get those, but I'm just going to go ahead and read a couple of these reviews. First one is from a good friend of mine, Trey Hackney. I promise that didn't weigh in on him getting this, but this is a pretty awesome review. So the legendary Gavin McClure dives in deep with the world's best paragliding pilots to get the essence of what it takes to be great, to be safe, and to excel at all facets of the sport, from beginning to kiting to the highest levels of cross country and acro flying. His insightful style, mixed with his world-class experience and expertise in the sport, put him in a unique position to probe intelligently into the minds of the legends of free flight and to pull out the best advice in every topic imaginable. Each episode is packed with lessons, insights, theories, and experiences that are worthy of paying big money for a clinic. I can't help but to feel that listening to these shows is almost like cheating for the new school pilots, and as an advanced pilot, I find myself absorbing into it like a sponge. The caliber of guests and their accomplishments is ridiculous, and the format is like a fireside chat with the world's best. I'm convinced this series of podcasts is the single greatest resource of collective knowledge for our global flying community in existence to date, and it's all in a highly digestible format. Just put the earbuds in, click play, and be transported to a master's class in the theory and the black art of paragliding. Thanks, Gavin. This is the shit. Giant hats off to you for putting this out there. We all owe you a debt of gratitude. If you are a pilot, there's no excuse to not listen to each of these amazingly informative shows. Some of the tips you learn could put you on the track for a new personal best, a podium, or save your life. And interestingly, a little aside, I've been getting quite a few emails that this podcast has saved their lives, which is really cool. I dig that. And for real folks, support his effort and come off the hip and kick him a few bucks to encourage this epic resource to keep going. It's so worth it to be able to glean into the world's best pilots who are spilling the beans and openly sharing their experiences and hard-earned secrets. This is an amazing, exceptionally informative, and entertaining series, and a must-listen for all free flight pilots. Thanks, Trey. That's awesome. I'll be kicking you down this mount for that incredible review. Thanks so much. The other one goes to Rodrigo Ciudad. I hope I'm saying that, Rodrigo. Imagine driving up to the launch pad and instead of listening to a friend saying, "I don't know if we can fly today," you are listening to Gavin, a pro who has crossed Alaska in a glider among other adventures, talking to every expert in the sport and about their rad adventures and how to crack the code. For sure, you'll reach the top with an improved flight plan and morale. I've heard most episodes of Cloud-Based Mayhem more than twice, and they have brought up subjects from every part of the flight discipline. Tips for beginners, what kind of school to enter, who to listen to on launch, how to be aware of the intermediate syndrome, the $1,000 question of when to move up on a hotter glider, planning your first XC flights and adventures, and more. They are simply addictive. For those already awesome pilots who think they have nothing to learn from these legends and world champions, you have probably lost the sky crack. We have to give credit to Cedar for that. Time to get it back. Thank you for spreading the knowledge, Gavin. So Rodrigo, I'll be sending you one of these mounts as well. Thank you so much. And yeah, let's get into this show. I really do appreciate that, guys. It just brings a smile to my face. It makes all this work really worth it. We've got a lot of great shows coming up, some really exciting folks and topics, and I think you're going to dig it. It's so great to be back from the race and being able to dive back into this. With Honza, we get into a lot of amazing areas. I think this is all very digestible and usable, and I think it'll make you safer, and it'll help you have more fun and understand what you're seeing in the sky better. So let's get into it. Enjoy this talk with Honza Rejmanek. Honza, it is great to have you on the podcast. I've been so excited to talk to you for so long.
Hey, Gavin. It's great to be on your show, and I've listened to many of the podcasts and enjoyed them very much, and I definitely recommend them to everybody who
Thank you for that.
listens to them or hasn't discovered them yet.
I was actually just talking to Ben, one of my supporters in the X-Alps and training partner and just friend, and I know you met him in the last race. And I told him I was talking to you, and he's like, man, I wish I could just take his brain and import all of that data into mine, like all this meteo. So I'm really excited to talk to you. And I was thinking it might be fun for us to just start. Typically, I start by asking, what's your history and what have you done? But I really want to keep this on your meteorology knowledge, and I'm going to put in the show notes and in the intro about your 5 X-Alps and all the stuff I know about you. And you used to live here in Sun Valley, so I think I'm going to try to cover that somewhere else. And let's just get into your meteorology background and knowledge. And I thought a great place to start would be on a fun story. In the 2015 X-Alps, your last X-Alps, which was your 5th, I think it was the day you and I were flying into the Matterhorn, you got way tall and were flying in wave. So why don't we start with just what is wave, and do paragliders fly in wave?
Yeah, wave basically is, in order to have wave, you need stable air, you need wind, and you need something to sort of perturb it. So a good way of thinking about wave is if you have a river, and even if there's a fairly smooth bottom, but there's one boulder, it'll form an undulation downstream that'll propagate much higher up than the boulder itself. So, yes, sometimes paragliders can use waves, but it's more, the wind is reaching levels that's near the upper limits of what a paraglider would want to fly in. Of course, sailplanes and some high-performance hang gliders will use waves regularly. And the amazing thing about waves, they reach much, much higher than the terrain that induces them. So what happened to me in the 2015 X-Alps is I was starting to cross that really long, I think it's the longest glacier in Europe, if I'm correct. It's a famous, yeah.
Yeah.
And I had thermaled up. It was a great day. I had thermaled up to around the 4,000 meter mark, a little over 4,000 meters. And then I was starting to, really, I was deep in, kind of on the north side there, and wanted to cross the glacier without any issues of landing out. That's why I topped off as high as I could. And then I just started punching into wind, and there's very smooth but light 0.5 meter per second lift. And it was very widespread, very smooth. And I started to notice that basically I was getting above most of the cumulus cloud tops. The cumulus weren't developing very deep, and I realized this was wave. And I wish I'd really had a little more time to see how high I could take it. Eventually, I just continued to punch forward and drop back out of it and got into thermals again. But it was remarkably smooth and light lift. Like I said, probably 0.5 meter, maximum 1 meter up. And I got to about 43, maybe just short of 4,400 meters in it. So I didn't take it up very high, but it wasn't thermal lift. It was like ridge soaring a really shallow hill in effect, but the lift kept going up and up.
And how do you differentiate that between, like, at first, did you think, oh, I'm in a sweet convergence line?
I thought it was just like, my first thought is this is just thermal tapering, tapering out, maybe just in a, that it wasn't doing the typical kind of getting rowdy near the inversion, but that it was just kind of just a large amount of lift tapering out. So actually I wasn't necessarily thinking convergence, but it took me a little while for it to dawn upon me that it must have been wave. And I think what happened is, this undulation, the top of lift, where, the thermals top out. They top out because they hit either an inversion or at least a very stable layer. And the top of lift itself doesn't have to be the same everywhere. So I think there was a bit of a dip over the large glacier area. And as I punched upwind, I basically flown, from the top of thermals, which are a little higher over the terrain, and punching out forward through it, I punched into that stable layer that had a little bit of an upward component in it. And it just kind of let me, as I was going more into wind, I was just going ever higher at a very slow rate of ascent, but just going ever higher. I think I took a few circles in it, but I realized I was drifting quite a ways back with it, and it wasn't really necessary to circle it. And plus I was trying to go westward. So I realized, yes, this is wave. And a big part of me thought, well, this would be really cool to just, take it up as high as I could. But it also, the higher it went, there was a little more wind where I figured, well, this isn't inefficient about making distance. And that's what in the X-Alps, we're always trying to make some distance.
And didn't you say before we started recording, you were talking about the Korean? He got super tall that day. He was the only other person that took that line I did, kind of from Bellinzona kind of right through the middle, kind of punched that through the middle over, and then near the Simplon. Didn't go over any of the real passes, but just, I guess, north of the Simplon. I only found that out later on, but looking back at the track logs, after the race was over. But didn't you say he got like over 5,000?
I think so. I'm not 100% sure, but I know towards the end of the day, as I crossed over the main valley, there's like a upside down Y as you go towards the Matterhorn.
Mm-hmm. Between the Sass and the Zermatt.
Yeah. So just before I got to where that Y splits, I'd seen an X-Alp pilot that was quickly hiking up a hill carrying his gear, because I think he'd made a glide somewhere and had to hike up a little higher to relaunch. And then I believe it's the same guy. I mean, they all look the same. They're all white gliders with X-Alps logos on them. But I basically remember flying with someone for a while, and then later, after just tagging the Matterhorn, it to me didn't seem like there was any way I could, in that Matterhorn area, punch into wind and make distance going forward. Obviously, I was wrong, because from what I found out later, the fellow from New Zealand had just about 15 minutes earlier managed to punch through there. And my plan at that point was just to go tag it and fly back out into the main valley. And I knew that maybe the next day I'd be hiking the whole valley all day, which is what ended up happening for me. But when I saw, after I tagged it and I was topping off to make sure I can fly back out the Y, I saw this pilot, and it was an X-Alps pilot, and he was further to the east, punching into the wind, and didn't seem to be going forward very much, and just kept going higher. And I was concerned for him. I thought he might, get himself in a position that he could get blown back. But it sounds like he got. I think he eventually made progress. And you're saying he actually continued westward?
No, I don't. I think he actually got hung up there. I think that was it. He basically took that same line that I did from Bellinzona, but once he got into the Zermatt something happened there. I actually don't remember. I'd have to go back and look, but I just, from looking at the track logs, I wasn't paying attention to his height. That was new to me, that he'd gotten so high. I just didn't realize it's just interesting, because I spent a lot of time that day at the Matterhorn trying to get, everybody had flown back out to the Valles, and I was getting messages from Bruce, do not come down here. Do not come down here. Everybody's getting stuffed. Go the way Ferdinand did, which was get high at the Matterhorn and just fly basically towards Verbier, basically just stay in that high terrain. And, but cloud base was maybe 42, 43. I mean, I barely squeaked out of there. So it's, it's interesting that it was the kind of day where you could have gotten really tall even over that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Before we started recording, you and I were talking about some of the things we could talk about. There are a million, almost don't even know where to start, but you were talking about, and basically how air, that kind of a common misconception about how air moves over terrain. Can you elaborate on that and what you're talking about?
Yeah, basically something that took me a while to figure out is what we see as the terrain is not exactly what the air sees. And to clarify that, it's basically the terrain can be fairly complicated, and the air tries to smooth it out to a certain extent. So what it'll do is, on the upwind side of things, it creates a stagnation zone, a little high pressure area. And the way you could think about this is almost like on a windshield in a car when you got a bunch of drops on it, and you could see certain ones are going to the left, on one side, and certain going to the right, and some are going right over the top if you didn't have your windshield wipers on. So, and then there's a point where there's almost no movement. So on the upwind side, there's a stagnation zone, and air can be fairly still, which can be, even on something as nicely shaped as, say, a volcano, can be somewhat deceiving if you happen to be a little way below the summit, but on the upwind side. So what I've found in those situations is, if you don't have the luxury of hiking all the way to the top of the mountain to see how strong the wind is on top, and you're planning on launching partway up somewhere, it's not a bad idea to hike to the crosswind side. Or the other way, the flip side of that is, if you get to the top of a mountain and it's too windy to fly, it might be potentially safe to fly lower down if it truly is a wind gradient and only the top is feeling really strong wind. But if you're making your way down, check the crosswind side again. If you hike 1,000 feet down the upwind side, you might find that it's 5 to 10 miles an hour, or almost the wind might be almost non-existent. But if you walk at that same elevation, 1,000 feet below the summit, to the crosswind side, and you find that it's just blown like stink, that can be you could be getting fooled, because you could have put yourself in a stagnation zone. This is kind of a similar thing happened on a feature that wasn't even as nice as a volcano. This was with the 2015 X-Alps, after we got the Lermoos turn point. That was the turn point by the Zugspitze, right? Yeah. So there, I hiked up to a spot, and I was waiting. I mean, basically I had almost no wind, almost nothing to even bring a glider up in. And maybe 200 meters above me and off on a shoulder, maybe 2 kilometers away, was Thomas Dorolote. I'm sorry, I can miss.
Yeah.
I don't know. And we had called each other because he knew from the live tracking I was there. And he was saying, it's just ridiculously windy right here. I mean, I can't believe you're even sitting there thinking of launching. And I was like, I've got nothing here. I got nothing to even pull up in. And I knew once that there was wind coming from Lermoos, kind of from the north. And I knew once I launched into that, I would be launching into a river of wind. But, it seemed like the transition wouldn't be that crazy. And it wasn't. And then they ended up actually hiking more to my spot to launch. And we all caught up and got a bit of a flight that day, which was nice. That was actually a pretty crux move. It's important to realize these things, that even upwind side, which is, you would think, well, I'm on the upwind side, I should be feeling the true wind. It's not the case. And, another example of that is just you look at the leading edge of a paraglider, we see something that's got basically a hole in it, or a cutout, but the wind sees a closed leading edge.
Sure.
So, yeah. Or the last one I like to explain is, this is the reason you can stand up and pee out of your harness, because you actually are peeing out of the stagnation zone. The wind is not, there's a dead spot that you kind of go through, and if you arch it right, it comes down between your legs. If you screw up, it goes in your face. But
that's a good one.
Yeah, so
I've never been bold enough to even try that.
Yeah, but there's that stagnation zone if you do it right. Yeah.
Honza, gust fronts. This is something I think a lot of people really struggle with, and ideally, you just don't fly those days that can overdevelop in the first place. But let's face it, we all have to if we're in the X-Alps, and we all probably do anyway if we're not, because that leaves a lot of days on the table. And, in a lot of days, the Duo-D, you still have a pretty safe, workable window before it goes too ballistic, and, especially on terrain. You and I were talking about, one, I think it'd be really fascinating and interesting to hear your thoughts on the difference in terms of how you assess these things when you're in different geographical locations. In other words, like the Alps versus the desert air of the Rockies. So maybe take that one first, and then I'll ask you about, just how do we assess these things?
Okay, well, first, it's important one thing to keep in mind is a lot can change in 20 minutes, because it's kind of a convection, like a scale of convection. If you're, 15 to 20 minutes is sort of a turnover time. If you're a thermal from the ground to top of lift is going to be about 15 minutes for you. If you're a thunderstorm cloud, you could have been in that parcel of air could have been near the ground and could be up at 10, 12 kilometers in about 15 minutes. And so a lot can change in 15 minutes. And if you ever watch time-lapse videos of thunderstorms and you watch the clock running if they have a little clock running with the video, it's amazing to see how much suddenly 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes, what a difference that can make. So, I would certainly not advocate flying when it's really starting to blow up. The other part of that is in the growing phase, you've got to be far enough away so you don't get hoovered up. When a real storm that's starting to build, we can be, confetti to a vacuum cleaner, literally, and short of free falling away, it might not get out. I mean, if you think about what creates proper hail, that hail is suspended in free fall, taken up in the thunderstorm, recycled, and recoated several times. So that, to get stuck in a thunderstorm, you've made several mistakes along the way.
What kind of hoovering are we talking about in a proper thunderstorm? Like the thing that Eva got caught in, or, give me some examples. Are we talking 20 meters a second, more?
It can be more. It can be, it could be 30 meters per second. And some of the ones that'll make, and those are more rare that you see those maybe out in the Midwest, but the kind that can start to make golf ball or baseball size hail, those can top out at 60 meters per second. You can have 120 mile an hour wind going straight up. So you could just about suspend a skydiver, belly, going belly flat in that. So wow,
you don't even need to go in a tunnel.
No, it'd be like
you could just go get in one of those.
Exactly, it'd be like a vertical wind tunnel. So and those, those will overshoot past into the stable, a little bit, almost touching the stratosphere. I mean, there's the top of the troposphere, and there's the tropopause, which is a very stable layer, and then actually the stratosphere is like a massive inversion, and that's why no clouds really make it to that, but those kind of really massive cells can they can shoot up another 5,000 meters before they come to a true halt. But that's the most extreme case. But basically, if we're flying around, and once rain starts dropping out and you start seeing vertigo, there's the potential of a gust front, or at least in drier locations, there's also the potential of a microburst. The whole rain shaft might not reach the ground, but if cloud base is quite high, say you can have sometimes out in the desert regions, cloud base 3,000 meters over the ground, and the rain is falling most of the way down that, but not quite reaching the ground, that air is those raindrops are evaporating as that's falling, and it's becoming ever more negatively buoyant. So it's picking up speed on the way down, and you can have these basically bombs of air that might be, a kilometer across, hit the ground and just, send wind in, 40 mile an hour wind plus in every direction. I mean, it just hits the surface, and the place where that would be most visible is if you have like a dusty playa or somewhere out in the desert. In those conditions, you might be better off, if almost staying up high, or even if you're, my thought is if you're in mountainous conditions and it gets beyond the level where you're comfortable with it and you're seeing it starting to gust, a lot of vertigo dropping out or rain shafts dropping out, you might want to think of landing high, and even if you have to hike it out, because if you have in your head that you have to land in the valley, that could be another 10 minutes of getting down. So that could be a problem. The other way, if it's not that extreme, you might just be able to fly away from it, especially if, you're not downwind of it. I mean, you might be crosswind of it, or there might not be very strong wind aloft. And, we can do pretty good speeds. I mean, we could do 50, 60 kilometers an hour on a modern paraglider. So you can actually make some distance getting away from these things, especially in the crosswind direction. The other thing, as far as terrain and the difference in maybe open desert areas or even areas like Sun Valley, is if you have really wide valleys. I mean, we can have 30, 40 kilometers from one mountain range to another. Those are really wide areas to spill air into. We also tend to have much drier air and, for the most part, much cleaner air. So you can see these things sometimes 50, 80 plus kilometers away. So having, being able to monitor these things from further off, or just having good visibility, I think is important, because if it's really humid, damp air, and if there's a lot of fine dust or aerosols in the air, you might have visibility of 15 kilometers, and that can get complicated. Like in the Alps, you might not even see the rain shaft that's dropping out a tight valley, and if it sends it down a focused valley, that gust front can run much more like a broken dam, like if you had a dam at the back end of the valley and the dam broke and all the water came rushing down. That's a way of thinking about it. Whereas if it happens over a really big open area or really wide valley, the energy gets dissipated sooner and spills out and loses its speed sooner with distance. So those are just some thoughts.
So in Europe, the complicated side of it there, if I could summarize, is that it's more humid. So the air it might look like a very clear day, but we can't see nearly as far as we can in drier areas just because of the humidity. And I want to ask you also about, the power and the force of water. So that'd be fascinating to get into. But so Europe it's more humid air, but it's also much more complicated terrain and typically much lower base. So we're not getting high enough to necessarily see very far, but it's also because things are so complicated. You and I'm sure, have many stories of especially in the X-Alps where you're really often having to fly kind of on the margins of stuff. But I've been there where something is dropped out, 3 valleys over, a long ways away, and it gets really interesting how that avalanche, as you call it, travels.
Yeah, I think avalanche or a burst dam is the way to think about it, because basically it's a cold density current. So it's going to, some of the strongest winds in a gust front are going to be running down the way water would run down. It'll follow, it'll follow the bottom of the valley, and higher up, you might be better off. So if if there were a place to land, if you see something weird in the valley, and you've got a side, especially in the Alps where you've just got beautiful side hill landing options, some great pastures up high, and if you got a tight valley and something's dropped out into the valley, you might be best off landing up high and waiting for it all to mellow out, and then even if it's just a flight down at an hour or two later, at least you weren't kind of not having the idea I have to land in the bottom of the valley in that situation. Having the idea is like, hey, this is not right. Something's happening in that valley, and I might just want to put down the closest best place to put down, which might be up quite high.
What are you looking at, Honza? When back in my sailing days, when I used to teach, offshore sailing and weather and to people, to the guests, one of the things we'd always talk about is squalls, because at sea squalls always come at night, but you can still see them off in the distance. And depending on where they were in relation to you at the wind, in other words, if you were downwind of them, we had to be pretty concerned about them. And there were kind of 5 things that I would teach them about, if the more of these things you have, if you have 1 of the 5, it's probably not that big a deal. If you have 3 of the 5, okay, we got to reduce sail before it gets here. If we got 5 of the 5, batten the hatches, we're in for some deep shit, and are there things that you're thinking about along those same lines when you're flying and looking at a day that's maybe getting a bit big?
Yeah, I would say, if you've got if it's a line of thunderstorms, then there might be no escape. This, especially if you've checked, and it's always a good idea if you get a chance, if you have, unless you're somewhere deep on a sky camping trip, somewhere where you have no internet coverage, then you might not really know what the winds are doing aloft. But if you have an ability to check winds aloft, at 700 millibars, which more or less is the 3,000 meter mark, and the 500 millibar, which is, can be around the 55 to 5,700 meter mark, based on how warm the air is. In those levels, if you see what the wind is forecast to be, that's, that can be the level that's going to drive the storm, because the storm is now starting to convect through the depth of the troposphere. So it's going probably from ground up to 300, maybe 200 millibars, up to, 10, 12 or more kilometers. You're not going to outrun it. If the thunderstorm is marching along at 20 plus miles an hour, it's going to overrun you. And especially if it's a line of thunderstorms. So those situations, certainly would be no good. Yeah, bad day. Yeah. And things happen quick. So it's I can, you got the time when it's building. And if you look at a thunderstorm, a proper thunderstorm, you got to realize there are cubic kilometers, many cubic kilometers worth of air that is rising fast. So a thunderstorm can even start to, switch local valley winds. If it's a proper one brewing, it can really start to draw, and it's becoming a monster on its own. It's not that it's just, it's not just the thermals feeding it. It is now all those little, water vapors condensing into all those little droplets, and that is adding warmth to the thunderstorm. It's making the air more buoyant, and it's offsetting the cooling as it rises, and it can really start to draw a lot of air. So there's an initial part even before it starts dropping out where the air can get really weird feeling. I mean, I can't describe it, but it just feels like it's kind of if you're still in the air, somewhat in the vicinity of something starting to grow that large. I remember one time entering into the Dolomites. I believe it was might have been the 2009 or the 2011 X-Alps. Might have been as far back as the 2009. But something was brewing not far in the Dolomites. It was still in the growing phase, but the air just had a kind of really funky little shear layers, and it just felt it was time to get down. It wasn't even though I'd want to milk a little more distance out of it, it was time to make the safe call and go land. So sometimes it's a feel thing. I mean, like I said, I wouldn't advocate to anyone to fly in anywhere near a thunderstorm, even one that's starting to brew. But then there's there's a fine line when you're not talking thunderstorm, but you're talking pretty big cumulus that are maybe starting to get a little taller than they are wide, and that's where everybody's got to make their own call, sort of based on their skill levels, and like in any kind of flying, you got to keep plenty of escapes. You got to have a series of escape plans at all times. You don't venture into something with no escape. So I think that's one way to try to keep this flying safe, is just really be aware of okay, in the next 5 minutes, if I need to be on the ground, what's my plan?
Yeah, I also like that you brought in intuition there. It's I think especially when you're early, if you're flying in a place like Annecy or Fiche, or where there could be 200, 300, 400 people in the air at any given time, make sure you're not being a lemming. There was a time in Annecy where one day we were flying, and this is maybe I had 100 hours that way. I was really new, and Big Cell kind of started developing over Annecy, and most people went and landed, including us, and a lot of people didn't. And then this thing just laid right back down. And I don't remember well enough if it was because there was some cirrus or whatever, but the cell just kind of dissipated, and we were all super upset. Oh, darn it. We could have kept going, which was, again, very juvenile flying, and you should never be that upset at that. And so the next day we went, and it was exactly this. It seemed exactly the same. Now you would have probably, picked out the differences, but very similar day, similar wind, same kind of cell. And so we decided, it's probably just going to lay back down. And it didn't. And luckily, this was actually with Bruce, who's my other supporter. And we had done, luckily at that point, quite a bit of SIV and some acro training and stuff. And we were able to spiral down to Plan F quite quickly, and then just pick up the pieces. It was, we just watched 200, a lot of the people that were left in the air, their kind of one move was like big ears. And people were bouncing off houses and landing in the trees, and it was really scary. And it made me. That was the first time where I kind of went, okay, wait a minute. These are hard to figure out. These are hard to call. And when is it going to get bigger? Are there other tools we can use other than just those visual ones? Like how do you go about assessing the day before you ever even step off the ground?
I think it's important, as much as you're, in a hurry to go fly, is to take that 15 to 20 minutes to see what's going on. And if there's a gust of any strength that you don't feel comfortable, that you wouldn't want to be launching into or wouldn't want to be in the air in, then I would say wait at least another 15 to 20 minutes. Sometimes I'd say a good half hour to make sure that was a very isolated incident and that it's not picking up. And hopefully, if a gust came through that was that strong for some reason, be it from wind or just a really ripping strong thermal, make sure that that's not repeating and that it's more in the calming stage and it's not in the building stage, because once you're in the air, you're gonna have to deal with it. I remember back in Sun Valley in my sort of early days, if if the anemometer at the top of the lift showed that it had been, I kind of made this arbitrary 26 mile an hour, gust of 26 mile an hour or more, that kind of became my no-no, because I remember one time just getting really scared when I didn't quite respect that. So I think the main thing is when you're getting your kit ready and everything, observe the conditions, or possibly even before you start getting your kit out, like take, maybe step away from the group and just watch it for a little bit. And there's a lot that can be felt on the ground, kind of, how quick, if is it gusty? Is it, are these wind gusts or are these thermal cycles? And usually wind gusts will be shorter lived. They can reach the same, they can peak the same way, hit the same strength as a wind, like thermal, or wind can make this feel like the same strength of wind on the ground. But a thermal will usually kind of build and then, back off. It's more of a kind of a 2-minute plus deal, a proper thermal going off. Whereas if it's on the order of seconds, where it just gusts really hard and then backs off, then that's more likely to be wind, and you might not be on, truly on the most upwind spot on the mountain. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say, what about what I was actually even getting at too is before that, what tools are you using online? I imagine you have access to stuff that a lot of people don't, but like if you're looking out tomorrow, next day at the potential for a day, what tools are you using then for weather? Are you looking at SQTs? Are you looking at XC Skies, Meteo Blue? What do you use in various places?
What I've discovered or been turned on to recently in the last half a year, and I've been very happy with, is the Windy it was Windy TV, Windy TY. I think now it can be found at windy.com, and you can download the app. I think they've changed the name a few times, but what is amazing about that app is the developer of that app he's kind of the Larry Page of the Czech Republic. He started a search engine that is still more popular than Google in the Czech Republic. So he's also an avid kiteboarder. Ivo is his name, and he has dumped a lot of his personal coding time and treasure into making this app. And he's actually purchased the rights to ECMWF, the European model data, because GFS is the other global model, and that's available for free. Like XC Skies uses GFS, but the ECMWF costs a fortune, on an annual basis to use. And he has been kind enough to basically sponsor that for all of us. So it's amazing because it's a free app, but you can look at the ECMWF, and the advantage there, it's a 9-kilometer grid. And the thing to keep in with models, basically there's two things that can help improve it. Is the way you bring in the data. It's called data assimilation, like every 12 hours up for that model, satellite data, sounding data from balloons, ground station data, all that is basically sort of massaged into the latest prior forecast, and then the model restarts a run from there on. So that gets kind of complicated, but the model, the way in which it does that, and then also the resolution, like this is a 9-kilometer global model, which is a very nice resolution these days for a global model. So it starts to pick out more features. Like usually takes about 4 grid boxes. So in this case, 9 times 4, 36 kilometers, things that are about 36 kilometers or larger start to be resolved. So you'll still won't pick up individual valleys, but sort of the shape of the Alps and some of the lower terrain features and passes start to get resolved a little better. And other mountains worldwide too. But that is really nice compared to 22, which 22 kilometers is the GFS, and that would mean 88 kilometers would be about the smallest feature that would start to get resolved. So it's two things: better data assimilation better resolution. GFS has an advantage. It gets initiated 4 times a day, so it can get updated. If there's something developing fast, it can pick up, any changes or assimilate newer data with a higher frequency, doing it 4 times a day instead of 2 times a day. So each one has some benefit, but historically ECMWF performed, on average outperformed the GFS. So having now for us to be able to look at a forecast, and you can look at the ECMWF, you can also look at the comparison of the forecast. So you can pull up a place and then look at ECMWF, GFS, and then a smaller scale regional model, or there's one for the US, there's one for Europe that you can look at there as well. But those draw off of the larger global model. But not to get too complicated with that, it's a really nice tool. I find you can do, you can look out forward in time. You can go up through the levels. It's great for wind. It doesn't have things like top of lift. It does have cloud base, but it doesn't have top of lift. I think there's still some things that, from a pilot's point of view, could be, developed into it. But that's great for trying to pick your day into the future. And then the day of is, a sounding is useful if you live in a place close to where a sounding goes up and at a time where it's going to be helpful. It goes up at noon, in Greenwich Mean Time, which would be like 1 p.m. in the Alps, which might be almost too late for starting some great flights. In the States, for us, it's maybe 5 on the West Coast. I think 6 in the morning. It goes up and usually gets posted about an hour later, sort of for the sun, for Sun Valley and Idaho and such. You can kind of see what the day is going to be like. You can see the lapse rate. You can see the wind through the levels. Of course, things can develop and change a little bit by the time you go flying. I think it's still worth learning how to read a SKUT diagram. There's a lot of stuff online about it. If I don't have time to explain it, nor would it make sense to explain it on a podcast, but I still think it's worth learning to read it. And then you see it. It's almost like a snapshot. It's almost like looking at a fingerprint. You see the SKUT and you can pull out a lot of info. You have the wind, you have the temperature profile, and you have the dew point temperature profile. So there's a lot of things you can start to quickly pick from that and start to see the fingerprint of the perfect day. Lastly, I would say for anyone, a lot of this is kind of figuring out what a certain forecast means for your place. I mean, and when forecasters forecast for a certain area, they get the model output, then they get model output statistics, which is basically statistical adjustment for if the model said it's going to rain 5 inches, but it's always only rained 2 here because I'm in a little bit of a rain shadow, it adjusts for that. So we might be more concerned about certain, how high did the thermals get that day based on a certain forecast. And some of that is just looking at the forecast, seeing how the day went, making a few notes and sort of an iteration of that. And it can be sort of years before you really get your place figured out. And if you're at a new place, it's about finding the guru that actually has got it fairly dialed. And then that's always the trick, is finding somebody that has, really got their place figured out. And if you can find that person, and it's not just somebody that's just, talking BS, but somebody that's really sort of taken the time and figured the place out, that's a huge resource if you can find somebody, a local that has that for a particular place.
Yeah, for sure. Tell me we were talking about water. Tell me about energy and water and how they relate.
Yeah. So, weather as we see it would be fairly boring if we didn't have water vapor in our atmosphere. You could the Martian atmosphere is much different because it's very thin. It's only about 100th as dense, but still they have massive dust devils and some strong thermally driven winds. So you'd still get valley winds, you'd get strong thermals, and you'd have a lot of dust devils if there was no water on this planet. But you wouldn't get hurricanes, you wouldn't get thunderstorms, tornadoes and such. You'd have no rain. But basically what water does, it takes a lot of energy to evaporate water. And that's why, a thin layer of sweat can does a great job of keeping you cool as a little, wind blows past you. That's why dogs panting with their tongue stuck out works to cool a dog. And it takes a lot of energy to evaporate water, but when water condenses, it releases tremendous amounts of energy. So water vapor, as in a scientific sense, you don't see water vapor. It looks just like the air. It's a clear gas. It's when we see cloud, or even the steam. When if you're boiling tea, the water vapor is the clear part. Once it's condensed, once you start seeing something, that's actually condensed tiny little droplets. So when you're seeing a cloud, it just countless tiny little droplets, and as the water is condensing, all that energy it took to evaporate it is being put back into the system. So a rising thermal will cool at a degree C per 100 meters. So if you're coring up in a thermal and you climb 1,000 meters, it's going to be 10 degrees colder. But when you form cloud, it's going to be, that cooling rate is going to be offset by the fact that you're condensing all this water into it. It'll still cool as you go up in the cloud. If you go up deep into the white room, it'll keep getting colder, but not as fast. And so basically what happens is you can get a situation, and that would be a situation when thunderstorms could develop, is where a big deep portion of the atmosphere would still be stable for a thermal. A thermal might eventually come to a halt, but a cloud will actually continue to accelerate upward, because it's now, with this condensing water, it's warmer and warmer than its surrounding as it climbs until it reaches a stable layer at the top of the troposphere. So the other thing, the water can converge, air with water vapor can converge from far away. Vegetation or large bodies of warm water can evaporate water over a large area, but can feed a thunderstorm that is located in a very small area. So, it's sort of a concentration of energy. I mean, water vapor is fuel for weather. That's one way of thinking about it. The other thing to keep in mind with water vapor is it's actually the most common greenhouse gas. It's actually, the greenhouse effect, the natural greenhouse effect, not the one we're adding to with all the CO2 we're putting in, but a big majority of that is caused by water vapor. And if you're ever in like a tropical place, you can have a clear night, but it doesn't get that cold. And for a long time, I always thought, okay, if it's a cloudy night, the clouds, keep the land from radiatively cooling and getting really cold. But you can have a clear night, but if there's a lot of water vapor in the air, like you're, in the tropics, it might not get that cold just because it re-radiates the heat back to you. I mean, some of the largest temperature swings day and night. I mean, Sun Valley is a great example. I mean, it can be 30 plus Celsius in the day, and then you go camping up Corral Creek, and in the morning you can have frost on the ground because it's up at altitude, so there's less air, and the air is usually fairly dry because that's kind of why we have such high cloud bases. So that's another way, to think about water. It actually can moderate the temperature swings day and night.
Huh, that's interesting. And so in a place that's really dry, like Sun Valley, that has those huge, in other words, so it wouldn't swing so much if it was more humid here, because it would moderate it. Am I understanding you right there?
You are, yes. So part of it is if it's more humid, then you're going to have a higher dew point. As you cool the air, there's a point where if there's more water vapor in the air, then the dew point temperature will be higher. If the dew point temperature is at freezing or below freezing, evening temperatures can really plummet and it can get quite cold at night. If it's a dew point of 10 degrees Celsius, like 50 Fahrenheit, you'll hit dew point, and then the surface as it cools, continues to condense water upon itself. So it can't cool very much more, because it just keeps the air keeps depositing the the water vapor in the air keeps condensing on the surface, and that's releasing energy, kind of warming the surface, offsetting this cooling at night. So usually if the dew point temperature, your low at night isn't going to be too much lower than dew point temperature, because it's just condensing. And that's how sometimes, in dry areas, if they have grape growers or citrus growers, they'll flood, they'll turn on sprinklers or try to bring up the humidity just so the temperature of the air, in their orchard can't drop so low, for example. Drier air, really areas of really dry air will go through bigger temperature swings. And just looking at, a difference between high and low temperature might give you a sense of like that place is probably going to have, especially midsummer, it's going to have stronger conditions for the most part, and probably higher cloud bases.
Why, Honza, why is that? So we've got these massive temperature swings and huge tall air in the Rockies, and yet I don't think of the Rockies as being a place that has really radical katabatic winds.
Well,
I think of places like Europe, and
yes, it depends on where. I mean, there's like katabatic, like evening. You basically are talking about the more like evening and morning winds where it just comes flowing down the slope.
Yeah, but where it can be kind of, there are places I've been in the world where that can almost be like a switch, and it can be quite violent. It could be really strong. Like Alaska had incredibly strong katabatic winds. And I think of places in Europe, especially when you're around the glaciers and stuff. But like I've flown around Mont Blanc at times where just having these epic days, and all of a sudden it's just bang, somebody's throwing a switch, and it's not fern wind. It's katabatic wind, and it can be quite strong. But I never think of that sitting in my valley here, that, oh, there it is, right as rain every day, and there it is. There's the katabatic wind. I mean, we get them, but they're rare.
Yeah, there's two things there. I think you touched upon. One is having the snow and the glaciers makes a huge difference. I mean, it doesn't take that huge of a snow covered side. You can have, if you have about a kilometer or more with snow, it doesn't take long before that starts to really slide down, because the day could have been great. It could be 20, 25 C, and then at the surface it's 0, it's freezing. Whereas if it had been rocky, it would take a long time for all those rocks or all that dry ground to even start to, it probably wouldn't even reach freezing at night. So that the fact that you're basically, that surface is freezing as soon as it can't, as soon as the upslope flows, the strong thermals get weak enough, it can start to really, really come on. And they can be, you can have 20 mile an hour plus winds. Just katabatic winds flushing down off something that doesn't seem all that large. But I think it would be interesting, if you took a profile of that, I don't think that katabatic wind would reach very high. It's going to reach its maximum right there near the surface, because the skin temperature right near all that whole glacier or that snow covered mountain, that it's coldest right near the surface. So it's spilling down like a big, the thin river coming off of it. And in Sun Valley, I remember in Haley in the morning, there was, out of one of the valleys, it'd be a pretty pronounced wind. It would be about 15 to 20 every morning, and it would all head out towards Sky Ridge, towards Road Run. You could actually kind of catch the katabatic east flow off of that. But so it can happen, but it's I think a big part of that, you put your finger on it, is the glaciers and the snow.
Okay. So just a matter of, so you can expect quite strong katabatic winds in the Himalaya, I imagine. In fact, I remember them distinctly when I was there. Switching gears here a little bit, Honza, I think a lot of people struggle. We have a lot of questions about flatland flying. I'm not a huge flatland pilot, but I have also struggled with cloud streets and blue holes. Can you just explain those from a kind of a meteorological standpoint, and then how you tend to deal with a big blue hole when you're sending it out, say across Nevada stand?
Yeah, I'll admit my flatland experience is also very limited. I think my longest one is here in the Central Valley of California, about around just a little over 100 kilometers, maybe 120 kilometers is my longest flat land flight, and that there I had great cumulus clouds marking exactly where I needed to go, and 2,000 meters was cloud based, so it was trivial. So cloud streets basically set up almost like a little helical circulation. They line up downwind, and kind of, if you did cut through it, there'd be basically, you could almost draw these little gears where it's sinking in the blue part and then coming up together, and those gears meet, and that's the cloud street. If you kind of looked at it, I guess, looking downwind, but a perpendicular cut. And there's great images of that online. You can also see great images of cloud streets if you look at a really cold air outbreak over a warm ocean. Like, sometimes there's great ones up in like Alaska as it comes off Alaska over the Pacific there, or sometimes really cold continental air that comes out over the eastern coastline. And you'll see those are really nice because you see the depth of the layer that convects gets deeper. So there's a bunch of tight little cloud streets on the satellite image. These are great on the MODIS, like the low Earth orbit satellites, just a snapshot image. And then the get wider, so they kind of readjust to get wider because it's the layers getting deeper, so it kind of, the scaling adjusts. And eventually on these satellite images far downwind, it gets to be more of a sort of a hexagonal pattern, or sort of a cracked mud pattern. So it eventually transitions to that. A blue hole is, if there's cumulus clouds everywhere else and there's a big blue hole, that means the thermals aren't even reaching cloud base. So there's always a portion of a thermal, or be it a nicely topped, like a fair weather cumulus that tops the thermal, it'll reach a little higher than you could reach it based on your sink rate. So the fact that if there's cumulus clouds around this blue hole and there are no cumulus clouds in the blue hole, hence the blue hole, for the most part, kind of the same amount of air, almost the same amount of air is going up as is going down. So that blue hole might be a place that is just set up to have return flow. And it could be because of the underlying surface, or just could be the way the convection set up that day. Probably, unless you feel like you got the glide to make it across the blue hole, it might make sense to go a little bit around. And it can be tough because you think, there's a lot of sun on the ground there, so that's great. But there's a lot of sinking air over that area to make that blue hole, so it might be, the thermals might be getting leaned up every which way out of it, and then feeding the clouds on the periphery. So I would think in that situation, deviating slightly from a straight line, unless it's a small enough blue hole that you're sure you're going to glide across, it might be the wise move.
Honza, what would be your suggestion? Maybe if you could think back to, say, your meteorology school days and becoming a meteorologist, and now, for pilots that aren't going to go as far as you have in learning about weather, what are the things that they still really need to know? What would your advice be to, just pilots at large, not thinking about if you're a beginner or advanced pilot, but just, here are the things, you've been writing the articles for cross country forever, and these are all, really specific. And audience, if you don't know about these, go grab every issue that's ever been printed and check those out, but those are really specific. I'm kind of looking more general stuff that's just very important, things that you're using all the time and going, God, I'm glad I know about that.
Well, I think the flying has two components. It's the piloting and the weather knowledge, and they're very complementary. I mean, if a deficiency in one might be compensated by the other, and sort of vice versa. I mean, if you're sort of ignorant to what the air is doing, but you've manage to become a really good pilot, which rarely happens if you're really ignorant to what the air is doing. But say you just have gotten to be a really good pilot, then you can find yourself caught off guard and still have the skills to pilot through it safely, or at least get yourself down on the ground safely. But a wise level of progression is to build your weather knowledge along with your piloting skills. And there's a lot of great books. I kind of there's one I read recently. It's by a German fellow on thermal flying.
Burkhard Martens.
Yes, yeah. That one. I thought that was really good. I read through that, and I think 97% of it I was in total agreement with. I mean, sometimes it's a tough call. Sometimes it's a fine line, and explaining the complexities without getting too complicated. Sometimes you have to simplify a little bit, but for the most part, books like that. I mean, I read Dennis Piggin's Understanding the Sky when I was 17. That was my first sort of big weather book that I got all the way through. And I think Will Gadd put it well once. You build a model in your head of how the air behaves. Then each time you fly, you refine that model. And there was 3 articles that Will wrote in the late 90s, I believe. Actually, kind of what got me, part of the thing that got me to go to grad school and study atmospheric science was this back and forth argument in the paragliding magazine on whether thermals, trigger or like surface tension of thermals and things like that. Some things that, might be an oversimplification, but realizing that some of this really small scale behavior, we haven't got it totally figured out. You need to know that, you need to know some weather basics. You need to know about pressure gradient and wind and stability. Understanding stability and wind, those are sort of the basics, the big weather systems, the circulation around a high and a low. But then the intricate stuff, the stuff that we really stumble around in, that's not resolved in models. That's where you, over time, you talk to other pilots. There's a lot of kind of folklore about it out there too. I mean, there's people have a lot of selective memory, and everybody's got a slightly different model of what's going on, and some are more correct than others. But you're basically, even to this day, I feel I get to a place and I look at it and I try to judge where's the wind coming from, what are the clouds, which way are the cloud shadows moving, little things like looking at a cloud. If you really want to get a sense if it's moving or not, if you're looking up or downwind, it's going to seem slower than if you're looking crosswind. Ideally, if you're looking at a cloud shadow, also look at sort of more crosswind, how it's tracking across the terrain. And then it'll get, sometimes if it's steep terrain, it can be a little deceiving because it rides down the slope. It's going to seem a little faster, for example. Ideally, it's moving across somewhat of a flat surface. But, judging the wind at cloud base that way, even when you're flying and looking at, take a moment to check the cloud shadows, how those are moving across the ground. If there's anything stirring dust down low, see how that's moving, see how the trees are moving down there. If there's something that's telling you that valley wind's strong, or, there's real constriction to the valley, the bottom of the valley might not be the best place to be landing. Oh yeah. And another thing I wanted to mention, when I'm on launch or looking at wind, I try to think of, sort of 3 levels that are superimposed. There's the forecast wind, or the synoptic wind, also called the meteo wind. And that's what you're going to get out of your forecast. That's what the model is picking up. But, that's a fairly large scale wind. That's what you would pick up off a weather map if you looked at the isobars. Then there's more of a regional wind that could be your, plains to mountain circulation that starts setting up. It usually starts developing around 10 to 11 o'clock. That depends a little bit on the day, but that's as things heat up and you create heat lows over certain regions that start to draw in the wind. And then the last is really local, slope flow and thermals coming up your mountain. And, keeping sort of this idea, there's these three levels to think about. Of course, it's, you could have as many distinct levels as you want. It's really a spectrum, but kind of thinking of it in three levels and realizing that any spot you stand on a mountain or in a landing zone anywhere, you're kind of getting the sum of these three levels coming together. And sometimes it'll reinforce itself. I mean, if your site is facing into it's an afternoon site and it's facing into a west wind that's 15 miles an hour, and you're getting thermals ripping up the face, and then those can be gusts to 25 miles an hour. You can also, be standing somewhere on east slope, and the heating of a large region out to the east starts to draw in a west wind that might not even be resolved in the models, but it just starts to create a heat low, and air will flow over the back, and it might start to blow over the back when you think it should still be coming up. So these are local effects, and a lot of it depends, on how strong the heating is that day, which sides are facing into the sun, the surface type. All these things sort of come together to create the wind that you feel at any one particular spot on Earth, really. So you can't be upset with a forecast if it's not panning out exactly when it said it. Over my spot, it should have been blowing, 15 out of the west. That's just one level, but everything else plays a role into that and either adds to it or subtracts from it, depending on where you are. And then, of course, there's a lot of channeling by the flow. Sort of in certain areas, it's reinforced. Some areas, it's blocked. I mean, as I mentioned, just looking at a river and looking the way it, splits the flow and causes it to come together in certain spots. I mean, you can have wind that eventually, a sea breeze that comes in late in the afternoon, wraps around certain areas and causes great convergence. That might be an afternoon phenomenon for that site. If it's a famous enough flying site, usually they've got their convergence sorted out. And if it's a place that very few people fly, or you're one of the first discovering this place, it might take a little while to sort out the specifics. These are a lot of little things to consider. This is basically what we refer to as subgrid scale. The grid or the resolution of a model is just too coarse, and it smooths out the terrain way too much to pick up all the little nuances that we as pilots become really attuned to when thinking about how the air is behaving and the way it's flowing and where we kind of expect it to be windy or where we don't. So I just wanted to kind of throw that in there.
Yeah, when you say that, it kind of makes me laugh, and that what we learned in this X-Alps in the 2017, after 2015, I heard from quite a few of the pilots that did really well that they had their own dedicated weather team. And these were guys that were typically like Meteo France or whatever the Swiss version of the same thing is. And these were guys that were just looking at, big servers that were processing a ton of data, so they weren't out with them on the course, but they were feeding them information. And in my mind, I imagine that they were, this is one of the things that lent to Kriegel's magic of, there's Cirrus coming, land, and wait it out, and then relaunch. And anyway, that's what I imagined. And so going into this one, I teamed up with Gaspard Petio, who had a weather team in 2015, and, he did really well. And so we shared his guy, and it was a guy that had been weather routing for the X-Alps since the very beginning. And so I was really excited about this. And we went and met him in Chamonix, and, we watched, we saw his 10 different screens. I'm sure the same kind of stuff that you have access to. And, his knowledge was like yours. It was just vast. And he was a paraglider. So I was really excited. Our team was really excited. And as we saw in the race, Gaspard, until he had his accident, was crushing. And he and I had the exact same weather data. And as we got separated, of course, it was, and our weather guy did say that, his models didn't really reach for those first two the leg down to Slovenia and the leg back up. That was kind of beyond the scope of his model, but he could interpret it still pretty well. But we actually didn't really figure out how to use it well to our advantage until probably day 6 or 7, because we were taking it, and I say we, really it was me, but I was expecting that this was going to be something that was really specific. This is what you're going to get here, and we could plan our day around that. And of course, these are just models, and they're no different than what, we've been using to help us fly forever. And, as we started to learn that, then it actually was really valuable, but it was still, they're just models. They're still generalities. Like the very first day when we knew it was going to be really, really strong fun and terrible weather on the north side. And it was going to, which meant, of course, it's going to be sunny on the south side, but terrible conditions. We had a weather report that morning that the race started that, it would be terrible, but probably flyable. And, winds of 25 to 35 coming from the north over the pass. And so if you could kind of hide from it and get in the lee, you could maybe make it work. And when I got up there the next morning, it was, 45. It was way stronger. And of course, I got upset that the weather report was wrong, that we were paying all this money for these really specific weather, but it wasn't wrong. It was exactly what you said. It was the model, but then, I wasn't taking into account, steps 2 and steps 3 and what you were talking about, the plains to the mountains effect, and then the thermal effect and all these other things that should help map it out. So by the time we figured that out, and it was actually really helpful. It freed up Bruce to not be looking at weather so much and being able to have this guy send us reports that were quite useful. But yeah, it was a good reminder that models are just models.
Yeah, and ridgetop compression is another one that comes to mind as you say that. I mean, is you can have easily an extra 50%, and in some areas almost 100% increase if it's compressing just right over a ridgetop. It's sometimes, especially more in the morning hours before the thermals have mixed things out, it can get, the ridgetop can really squeeze wind over it, and you can see that in certain areas if you have a location where there happens to be a mountain and a sounding that goes up nearby. So you can actually look at the same time the weather balloon went up. Locally, the two places that come to mind is we have a sounding out of Oakland, which is near San Francisco, and then there's Mount Diablo, which is not too far away. And then we have Slide Mountain and Reno, which are both probably within 30 kilometers, 20 to 30 kilometers, if that, from where the balloon's going up, where this peak of a mountain is. And there's been times where at the same exact time, it's showing twice as much wind on the mountain. I had Dave Turner tell me he's got an anemometer that he looks at Mammoth down in the Sierras, and it can be more than double of what the true wind is doing, just the way it's coming through a gap and really being squeezed through there. So that's that's certainly something to keep in mind. And and that compression is very much something to respect, but also to know, an advanced pilot might use that to their advantage. I remember when I was very sick in the 2007 X-Alps, and I was coming up late the first day on the Dachstein, and it was too strong for anybody to be launching on top, but they, dropped 200 meters down the upwind side, and they were able to launch, and then kind of staying out in front and out of that strong compression, a lot of people are able to make some distance and actually get some flying in, even though reaching the top, it looked like it's just ridiculously strong. But so I think, it all comes back to sort of building building that mental model. You're somewhere and you're realizing, okay, is this really like a really strong wind that I'm feeling? Is this really true wind, or is this just compressed? Is this a venturi? Is this going to be everywhere? Or if I do hike lower and kind of fly out and low and get up higher, will I be blown over the back, or is that a safe thing to do? And those are, it's not something I can recommend one way or another. It's something that each pilot has to sort of assess and decide, and build up to it, I would say, rather slowly rather than jumping into it.
Great stuff.
Yeah. One last thing that comes to mind with the sort of convergence areas, and if it is windy, I've found that sometimes the calmest wind on the ground is under the greatest lift above you, which is, when there's a strong convergence, if two winds are coming together, you can be, a kilometer or two away and you're seeing the trees leaning over and shaking. And then you can, run downwind a little bit because you see, okay, I don't want to land there. You run downwind and you can suddenly find a place, even just that the wind is calmed way down, and it's just slamming a wind that's wrapped around and come from another side. And, often there's great convergence, great lift over an area where right there on the ground, it's actually fairly calm to land. And once again, that's something you sometimes stumble upon, but it's good to kind of keep that in mind, that if something is really going up and it's not dynamic lift, it's not, you realize, okay, this isn't thermal. It's too big to be a thermal. And it's not wind hitting a mountain per se that's causing all this lift. It's got to be air converging. And if you find that, either you can take that convergence and continue on with your cross-country flight, but there might be a situation where it's just too much, it's overwhelming, it's uncomfortable, and you want to go down and you don't want to land in very strong wind. Well, if you can get yourself down through it, then you might actually find some of the relatively most mellow air just below that. Because if air is coming in, two batches are coming in at each other, they have nowhere to go but up. But right at ground level, that can be very calm.
Ooh, so, wow, that sounds like a dicey proposition, but I like it. I can totally visualize it. But it's as long as you,
it's a tough one because you're trying to come down through a lot of lift. That's the dicey part of it, is that if you're trying to come down through a lot of lift, and almost might want to leave the lift for a little bit, but if you're seeing that it's just too windy to land, but it might be just at the area of convergence, just when you're up right above the strongest convergence on the ground, sometimes that'll be the lightest air movement right there at ground level.
And theoretically, I guess if you did get the convergence zone pretty right, even though it's going up strong, it shouldn't be going up in a way that would be really radical if you're spiraling down through it. It would be a lot of work, but it wouldn't be unwieldy.
Right. Or you could often these things slant a little bit too. If you get sort of the perfect strength of two winds, that are the same strength and slam each other. But I've often found these things tend to lean one way or another. It's almost like creating this invisible ramp in the air, and from your, you must, from all your sailing, I haven't done much sailing, but you do see when there's a line of whitecaps and then there's pretty calm water, and it only makes you think, well, you can't have 20 mile an hour wind hitting nothing, and the only place it has to go is up, and it's probably creating some kind of a ramp. So the air over where it's still calm is kind of stagnant. It's either like been forced because it's heavier, it's backed up against something, or it just hasn't gotten up to speed yet. As something is coming in, this line of whitecaps, is going to cause this kind of a ramp. And you hear of situations, and I've had one or two opportunities on the coast where you can suddenly soar that sort of invisible hill way higher than any local terrain. You're basically kind of soaring a slanted convergence. I mean, some people call it, like on the coast, soaring a shear, and it is a little bit of a shearing, but it's kind of a slanted convergence. So that's and often that's kind of a finite area. Like if you run downwind too much with it, you might go into that, slower air and fall out of it again. So there's times you definitely want to take it, recognize a convergence and take it up. And there's times where it's, it might be too much, too rowdy, and you might just have had an experience where you just really want to be on the ground. But keeping in mind that right at that converging area, there might be a calmer area on the ground.
Fascinating. Cool. Great stuff.
One last one. When thermals, I thought another thing that took me a while to kind of, when it dawned upon me, and it was kind of one of those aha moments, is realizing when you get a low save, it's often those that take you right back up to base. And a part of that is just because in order that you have so much air converging near the ground already, and it's got enough of a vertical component that low to the ground, it's only going to get stronger as you go up. So slightly selective memory, but I've found a low save is often the one that takes you right back up to base.
Yeah, I'm laughing as you say that, because the probably the most exciting low save I've ever had, and it wasn't, usually you think of those as like being in a comp or something, but when I'd split from when Dave left in Alaska and I went on, to finish it, it was like 2 or 3 days into my part, the kind of the solo part, and I'd had a big day, just 2 or 3 really nice flights, like a morning sledder over the Susitna River, and then hike up, and then a big, nice flight. And then I kind of screwed that up because I was really trying to stay with the terrain, and there was just this incredible cloud street out over the flats. And I just couldn't trust. I didn't believe it. It was like, God, these mountains should be booming. And there wasn't a cloud over the mountains. And what I later figured out was that there was so much pressure difference between the north side and the south side. And I was on the south side, and there was a ton of wind coming from the north because of that pressure gradient. It wasn't until it spilled over the mountains down to the flats and then was releasing it. So anyway, I bombed quite late in the day. It was, but not so late for Alaska because solar noon is 2 up there. So it was, 6 o'clock, I'm on the ground, but I'm just looking at this incredible sky going, God, man, I can still cover some distance here, and kind of X-Alpsed it, packed up real fast and ran up this micro hill. It was kind of at the bottom of this moraine in a glacier. And I went up this hill that was maybe 200 meters, probably not even. And it was quite windy, kind of a valley wind, blowing down on me, but the wind was going the right way. It was blowing kind of south, I guess it'd be southwest, which was the direction I was trying to go. And southeast. And so I thought, well, if anything, I'll get 3 or 4K just winging it downwind. And that's better than walking 3 or 4K. So I launched and kind of ridge soared a little bit, and then, went with the flow and went around the corner and got right over this huge herd of caribou. And literally right over their heads, they were looking up at me. And so I wasn't really even focused so much on the flying. I was just tripping out on this, this beautiful evening. And, the sun's far from setting, it doesn't set until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning that time of year, but it's just really pretty. And I kept, I caught this like zero, just turning in this thing, just downwind, just winging it, like felt like a Frisbee, and it went probably 4 or 5K like that. And then 0.1, and then 0.2, and then 0.3. And then eventually it turned into the strongest thermal I'd had on the whole trip, and went from, that I was pretty much at 0 elevation when I started this thing, 200 meters up the hill, but the valley bottom was basically ocean level. And I went to 16,000 feet. It was the big, by far the biggest climb, and the highest I had been on the trip by 5,000. Even going across Denali, I think we got to like 11.5. And this was, as you can imagine. And it was then I went on like a 30-mile glide without turning. It was just unbelievable. It was the coolest low save, basically circling right over these caribou heads. And then this thing it felt like I was just flying in a river, just zeros and zeros and zeros, but staying alive. And luckily the valley's kind of dropping away a little bit, but not much, like I said, because I'm basically at sea level. And then boom, it's terrific.
Nice. Yeah, so I think sometimes that's more than just coincidence. I mean, of course, we have our kind of selective memory of the times things worked out. But if you, I do believe there's a lot to be said for something. If it can keep you from sinking out that low to the ground, something is happening near the ground. Basically, there is air converging onto something that's gonna probably going quite a ways up, because it's already starting to get a vertical component of at least 1 meter a second, or maybe 1.5 meters per second to offset your sink rate.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so close to the ground. And it's only in an accelerating environment at that point. So it's going to accelerate upward for a while. And usually if you can hook full circles in something like that, or almost full circles that near the surface, you usually have a ride right back up to the top. Yeah.
It's very cool. I'll always remember that one.
Yeah, it's a lifelong learning, really. It's
that's what makes
I'm
the
still
sport so great, isn't it?
It does. Yeah. I mean, you're basically you've got your best current model in your head, and you go out there and you test it. And I think I've been fortunate enough to I've been very fortunate to have had an opportunity to fly many different places. And you sort of, you can arrive at a new place and have a pretty good idea of how it's going to work. But then there's always a lot of little things that surprise you. I mean, you're like, that totally should have worked, and it doesn't. And sometimes it's just the way things cycle. Sometimes it's, the way the wind splits and meanders. I mean, I've always thought it's great if you take some time to look at a river, and different kinds of rivers with different boulders and different current speeds. And you realize that's just the flow. And then we are flying in a boiling river, and it just gets really complicated, It's
That's a really good way to put it.
Yeah. So it can get infinitely complex, but there's still something about, figuring out, okay, in this much wind, I can go over the back at this height. Having that kind of intuitive feel, like that takes a while to build up to. First, in ground school, you learn all the things not to do, and then you sort of spend your flying career slowly picking apart at what of those things you can actually do. No wise instructor is going to go tell you to go fly over the back or fly in the lee, or all these things, and or fly in with there's any kind of overdevelopment happening. But as we talked about, there's that fine line, but that requires experience. And for pilots that are new to this sport, just I've always said, if you're on skis, you wouldn't go following somebody in between two cliffs, this tight little line, the stuff you see in the Banff film festivals. But since the air is invisible, there might be that guy out there that's flying and is making it look easy, and conditions are just really gnarly. But that might be one of the best big wave surfers out there, and he's just making it look just fine. So it's, in the end, before you take off, you're pilot in command, and you gotta make that call, and you gotta make the right call every time.
Well, that's a perfect place to end. Although, however, if you do have a few more minutes, I would be very remiss of one X-Alps junkie to another to not ask you at least one question about the X-Alps. I know you were over there while this one was going on, so this was the first one you hadn't done in 5 consecutive campaigns, and I know that there was a lot of mixed emotion, I'm sure, going on there. But when you look back, I asked this with our last guest was Max Van Durl, who did it 4 times, and I asked him this, and it was just a kick. I loved his reply, so I'd love to know what you have to say. When you look back at your 5 campaigns, can you give me one of the greatest highs and one of the greatest lows before we wrap it up here?
I would have to say one of the greatest highs was piecing together the second to last day in 2009. I mean, Tos, who was a phenomenal runner. I mean, just almost as good as Kanea, and a great pilot as well. and Evgeny from Russia. We were all within 5 kilometers of each other right there in the Chamonix area. And it was a day with fairly low base. And I think it was a piecing together of 9 mostly hopper flights. Towards the end of the day, I got a really nice flight into the area around Bourg-Saint-Maurice and made it up to past Val d'Isère, the Col des Arines, and then was able to even launch at the pass and fly a little further. But making all that come together, there was times I would, land, sometimes hike my glider up a little bit, sometimes, check my little GPS. I had one of those little yellow Garmins and pull out the map and see where I was, and make a little bit of a hopper flight and just land just below base and then hike through a little pass. I mean, it was just putting it all together. And at the end of the day, still, that was before we had sleeping rules. So just hiking through that whole night, just knowing that Aiden could run, but just, at that point I was third, and just holding on to that into the final day. I think, that was amazing. And to get to stand with Alex Hofer and Kriegel on the podium that next evening was just, that's unforgettable. That was, even though I didn't make it to Monaco and I was still 140 kilometers away, it was really, I felt like kind of pieced things together in a very X-Alps format. And it was before we were, things have changed a lot now. There's a lot more communication with the supporters, but in my early X-Alps days, I always felt that there was a certain purity to once I got airborne and once I got away from my support for that day, it was my show. It was my doing, my success or my failing. And that was a certain, beauty of it. I mean, it's definitely the race has advanced, gotten really fast, and it's just a whole different game as far as, support all throughout, even in the air. But I thought that was a great day. It was really pure and a lot of fun. The worst, it's hard to say. I mean, there were some long all day hikes in the rain, but that wasn't really that bad. That's just a part of it. I think one of the ones that really made me think hard, it was just, I started getting a little maybe overconfident about landing in the lee of things, just landing right into the wind. I was flushing down the hillside of a mountain where I would just have to, rather than land at the bottom, if I landed 200 meters in the lee and just hike up and over it and launch in the did too. And I was getting a little overconfident with that. In the 2015 X-Alps in the South Alps, I landed and it was gusting over 20. I was kind of in the 20 to almost 25 kilometer an hour. It was gusting pretty hard after I landed and hiking through it. And it felt like I landed in a parachutal stall. I mean, I came into the hillside, I still flared into the wind and everything, but the descent rate was just incredible. And, then as I hiked up and over to the other side, I had to hike down a ways and, it was a catapult of a launch, but it was one of those situations you realize you only get away with this so many times. And it's just, I would never do this in normal. There'd be no reason to do this in normal flying. And I realized, this is, this is just, for the sake of the game, I'm really pushing it. And it's kind of, I was a little bit upset with myself, and there's probably, there might've been other moves to do that day, to avoid that. It's one of those things. You just got to be a little careful when you start feeling a little too much like Superman out there. It's, I've always said with flying, especially in my early days, I felt like I went through periods of irrational overconfidence and irrational fear. And, sometimes you kind of get that buffered out and you're feeling, like you're really on your game, but you just got to be careful on both ends of it. If you're irrationally scared, then you got to kind of back off and realize, what are you scared of? Like, you can't be flying around that thinking this glider's going to kill me all the time, but you can't be, you can't be flying around forever thinking you're Superman either. I mean, there's times you might build up to that where you feel like, hey, I can just fly just about anything. Like I'm so dialed, but sooner or later you're going to get a reminder. You're just flying around in the sky, and you better watch it. So,
yeah. Well, that's certainly. I have felt exactly what you've just said. It's certainly about the X-Alps. And I had similar things happen in the 2015 campaign that I really tried to not repeat this time around. You definitely have to fly. You have to be on the margin there to do decently, just to do it anyway. But I think you can, with the right kind of training, the right kind of approach. It doesn't have to be terrifying. That can all be pretty manageable. But well, Honza, thank you so much. I could talk to you forever, man. It was great to tap into your brain a little bit for this hour and a half, and I really appreciate your time. And I'm sure we'll be doing more of these, and I can't wait to get out and fly Nevada with you. So, but let's end it there because I know we both got other obligations. And but thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Yes, no, sounds good, Gavin. I just want one last thing I want to say to what I've found has been really useful is even if life doesn't let you get out and fly too much, I still go ground handling to this day. 25 years into it, and I still go ground handling. And even the other thing, even if you're on a coastal ridge, practicing a little bit of side hill landing and being able to keeping sharp on being able to put it down where you need to is really important. So
great advice.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my knowledge, and I've really enjoyed these podcasts. I think this has been a great service for the flying community, and for those who haven't discovered them, check it out, and definitely please help support this effort, because this has been a really, really great service for soaring pilots.
Awesome. Thanks, Hans. Appreciate it, man. Talk to you soon.
All right, Gavin. Yeah, I look forward to flying with you soon. Enjoy your daughter.
I will. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, what a new cool adventure.
Yeah. All right, man. Have fun. Talk to you soon.
See you, bud. I hope you enjoyed that. Always great to sit down with Honza. We've been planning that one for months. Hope you got a lot out of it. As always, all we ask for is $1 a show. If you want to support the podcast, you can do it directly through cloudbasemayhem.com. You'll find links on there to PayPal, or you can support us through patreon.com. And on Patreon, you can kind of set it and forget it. You can opt for whatever level you want to do it at, and you can opt also to not have it go over a certain amount by month, but that just, you only pay for when we put a show out. So it kind of puts the onus on me. There's lots of bonuses if you want to support us at a higher level, and one of those bonuses is you get access to content that we don't put anywhere else out. And one of those is we just did an interview. Actually, I was interviewed by Nick Hawks, who we've had on the show before. He interviewed me for the Ground Handling podcast, and this one's just purely about the 2017 X-Alps. He asked me a lot of really good questions about why we did what we did and where we messed up and where we did well, and how it all went down, and just also generally about the X-Alps. So if you're interested in the X-Alps, hop on over to patreon.com and you'll see that. We're going to put that up here in just a few days. I don't know how to, I also want to make that available for those of you who are supporting us through PayPal, and so I don't want to make that just exclusive. I don't know how to do that. I haven't figured that out. On Patreon, I can just put it on there and make it for the Patreon supporters. But if you're one of our supporters through PayPal, you haven't done it through Cloudbase or through the Patreon page, just zip me an email and I'll provide you that link. But that's not going to go out on the social media, and it's not going to go up on the website. That's just exclusive content. We're doing the same thing for the follow-up talk with Kriegel. Talked to him a little bit after the main show that we had that we put up a few weeks ago. So I've got a little bit of that. Still waiting to finish that up with him, because we got all kinds of great questions from you, our audience, and can't wait to ask him those. But we've just both we're on different sides of the planet and moving in different directions and haven't been able to make it happen. But I promise you we will. We're trying. We will get it done. And if you can't support the show financially, I totally understand. I get it. You can share this with your friends. You can put it in a blog. You can put it up on Facebook. You can tell people on the way up to launch. This is all about just sharing knowledge. That's what we're trying to do. So thank you so much. Appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next show. Cheers.